Great
Okay,
stories.
I believe we are recording. Go ahead.
All right. Well, welcome to our next series of the legacy of H.T. Odum and systems ecology. I'm Dave Tilley, and here with my co-host Mark Brown from the University of Florida. And we're very excited today to have a very special guest, one of H.T. Odum's students from the University of North Carolina, Dr. John Day. He's a preeminent systems ecologist with a distinguished career focusing on coastal and wetland ecosystems. His extensive body of work, particularly on the Mississippi Delta, has significantly contributed to our understanding of deltaic systems, their vulnerabilities, and restoration strategies. Dr. Day's research spans multiple disciplines, including hydrology, wetland dynamics, nutrient biogeochemistry, and ecological engineering, emphasizing the importance of interdisciplinary approaches in addressing complex environmental challenges. His articles, such as those assessing the Mississippi's Delta multi-hazard vulnerability and the value of wetland restoration, highlights his commitment to integrating social ecological systems, thinking, that's a mouthful, into sustainable management practices. Through synthesis and review articles, Dr. Day has been pivotal in advocating for ecosystem-based management, providing valuable insights into the impacts of climate change and promoting nature-based solutions for coastal resilience. All right. John, you have a very distinguished career, and we're decades long, and we're great that you're able to join us. And of course, you were with Dr. Odum back in I guess in the '60s at Chapel Hill, and
Late 60s. I graduated in 1971, and actually, I went and spent about 5 months at the University of Florida to finish writing my dissertation.
now that I didn't know about. I think it's always curious for us to start with going back to before you made it to Chapel Hill. Like, what was your pathway to finding systems ecology, and how was it, those first meetings, or how, what happened in Chapel Hill when you got there?
Well, I got my master's my bachelor's.
That might have this problem.
LSU in zoology. And of course, people don't have zoology departments anymore, which is an indicated like. And my introduction to ecology, which I was really interested in, was sort of mundane. And my degrees were sort of kind of typical zoology, animals, and very little systems thought. And I remember they taught me ecology. We got into a discussion of continental drift, and the shifting of the plates. He wasn't sure it was true yet, and I'm a Louisiana native, as is my wife. She's a French, comes from a French background, and I come from a background. And so I arrived in Chapel Hill thinking I was going to work on ecotoxicology with Charles Weiss, because that's what my master's was about, the effect of a hydrocarbon on juvenile sunfish. But I arrived in May of 1968, and immediately went down to spend the summer at the coast there in Moorhead City, working on this big project with the ponds, which I think a lot of you remember. And that Odum, and it was like my mind exploded. I never met anybody like him, and I may have heard of him, but not very much. And so I started working on that project, and it turned out he and Weiss were my major professors, and I did a carbon budget and energy budget of the ponds. But like I said, it was like my mind exploded. It was like the Big Bang, and the result of that explosion is still raining down all around me, 50 years and 400 publications later.
So those were the saltwater ponds.
Mind changer.
Those were the ponds that were receiving sewage down on the coast in North Carolina.
That's right.
They were saltwater ponds, right, to start with, and then they put fresh water in them.
Well, they were estuarine ponds, and they had 3 of them there at the institute. 3 of them by the plant for the city of Moorhead. Moorhead City had its treatment plant on a creek, and they built 3 ponds the same size. And so the water in them was coming from the tidal. I think the salinity was very similar. It was a big multidisciplinary project with all sorts of people involved. Very, very classic Odum thing, you know. And it was just it was that period, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, all the things that were in society in those days. And so all of that was going on in the background. And then there was this incredible group of people around involved in this project. And so I got into, I started in the School of Public Health, Department of Environmental Sciences. About halfway through my career at North Carolina, they formed a marine science program. And so I moved into that, and I was actually the first graduate of the PhD program in marine sciences.
All right. Can you remember the name of your, the title of your PhD, your dissertation?
It was like carbon dynamics of estuarine ponds receiving treated sewage effluent, something like that.
All right. Something like that.
I have a of it here.
So you really got deep roots in the history of ecological engineering, because I think, you know, most of us think of that as one of the first projects on taking the wastewater and treating it with wetlands.
Well, and yeah, it was self-designed. That was a whole new idea for me. And I mean, it was just that whole time period was just, you know, wonderful. I mean, in society, things that were happening. Well, I can't tell all the things we actually did down at the coast because this is going to go public. But anyhow, yeah, and so I finished my degree, and I never applied for a job actually, any job, but I was working with Charlie Hall, and he went to work with George Hall, and there was some discussion about I might go up to Stony Brook. No, that last national lab up on Long Island and do a postdoc with Woodwell. But in the meantime, Odum went on. Between the time I got my master's degree from LSU and when I came back, they founded the marine science program, Sea Grant program started. And so Odum went on one of the first site visits down to Louisiana. And, you know, he went down there and listened to them. And he said, he told the dean at that he said, you guys need a systems ecologist to put all this together. And, you know, a few weeks later, the dean called me and said, we want you to come down would you like to come down for an interview for the job? And I really had no interest, no expectation that I was going to go back to Louisiana. You know, it's just, you don't work in the university where you got your degrees. I did my final degree there. Yeah. But so I went down for the interview. My wife was pregnant, and for the first time in the 3 years we were at Chapel Hill, we weren't going to go home for Christmas. And it was right about on Thanksgiving. And she said, well, just go interview. You can see the family. And I went down there not seriously thinking about the job. And so I guess I was a bit cocky. And I interviewed for 3 days, and they offered me the job at the end, you know. I don't know if they ever interviewed anybody else, you know, and it couldn't have been a perfect job actually, because it was a research organization with the marine science department sort of attached to it. And I was on hard money, and I had to teach one course a year. Wow. I taught estuarine ecology, and that evolved into the first edition of the textbook. And then, but it also gave me a lot of time, and I ended up, you know, following Odum's example and traveling extensively, and in the Mississippi Delta and then the Mississippi Basin with Bill Mitch, a lot of Odum's former students, and I got interested in Delta, so I spent a year in southern Mexico and Laguna and the Grijalva system in Laguna de Terminos, working on tropical ecosystems, and that went on for about 4 decades. And then I spent 3 sabbaticals in Europe, the Netherlands, which is the Rhine Delta, and then in the south of France, where we got to studying the Mediterranean deltas. And finally, I did a sabbatical at Cambridge, working with a coastal geomorphology who was also working in Venice Lagoon, where I worked. So I think I spent about 8 years out of the country doing my academic career. And
You really became this expert in deltaic systems and the wetlands and the restoration. That must have been incredible kind of thing just to journey to cover all those decades.
well, Delta science was really taking off at that period. Out it is, of the 10 mega deltas in the world, the 10 largest and most important ones, there's only one in a developed country. It's in the Mississippi. And so it's very easy to go out and do research. And the kind of research just hadn't been done in the other big deltas like the Amazon and the Orinoco and the Mekong and the Ganges, Brahmaputra, et cetera. And so I got in on the ground floor there, and I met, a group of Delta scientists that just started interacting, starting back in the 80s, really, well, even the 70s for the Mississippi. But so, and I just started working with this group of people, and there's never been anything formal done, but I don't know if you've heard of Jaya Savitsky. He's one of the leading deltaic scientists in the world, and he said he had a discussion with a other group of things and scientists, and they said that I was one of the top 10 delta scientists in the world, but it's not formalized. So I worked in the Mississippi my whole career. And then I started working in the late 70s in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. And that went on for about 4 decades. And then I went over and did my sabbatical, the first one in 86 and the second one in France. And I got into studying the Mediterranean deltas. That went on for over 30 years. And I got in on a big EC project and then a number of other smaller projects. And so I had tropical, temperate. I had big delta, small delta, and then I had the other thing that happened that I had a sheer, really comprehensive study funded by the South Florida Water Management District with Fred Sklar down there, who's one of my former students, and we did a big study of the coupling of the salinity transition zones from the Southern Everglades, the cladium marshes, out to Florida Bay. And that ended up with a series of publications. And I could do intercomparisons between karstic systems like in South Florida and then the Usumacinta Grijalva Delta and Laguna de Terminos, which were terrigenous systems, but that was relatively with the karst systems in the Yucatan. So anyway, I studied those systems and did a lot of process-oriented studies on water column dynamics and metabolism, aquatic primary production. Lots of Wilson works on almost every kind of wetland there is, except high latitude systems I wasn't interested in. I was much more interested in tropics. So I had a nice set of systems, and then I carried out these sort of process-oriented studies on hydrology, and I said water column metabolism, wetland dynamics of all sorts, hydrology, biogeochemistry, flux studies, working from the coastal ocean estuarine exchange to exchange with wetlands and open systems, and also these systems that are seasonally closed because of they're down in the tropics and have that seasonal pulse of rainfall, which opens them up. The ideas of Odum are all over the place there. There was lots of people involved, system properties, system functioning, taking all those process-oriented studies and putting them together and, publishing a lot of papers on it, but then writing a lot of synthesis papers. And through that, I got involved with this international group of Delta experts. And I, uh, I ever heard of the land ocean interaction in the coastal zone program, the Lowitz program? Well, I got into that in the early 2000s, and it's still going on. They don't travel all over the world like we did back in the start. But so I still interact with that group of coastal scientists, and that led to a lot of neat system levels publications.
So do you
So you
think
brought,
something's changing?
go ahead, Mark.
That the systems approach has begun to lose favor in the scientific world, or do you think it's still a very important part of science?
Well, I think it's not call it system scientists, but to understand. Another thing I got involved in was climate change studies, because if you work in coastal zone, it's on the forefront. So there are people system studies, whether they call them that or not, because you have to have a comprehensive understanding of these whole systems. You want to understand human impacts, changes in basin inputs, climate change. And then working with Charlie Hall and others, I got into energy analysis, with and the Mississippi Delta has been just ravaged by the oil and gas industry. And so I ended up writing a bunch of publications and a book on the effect of oil and gas activities in the Mississippi Delta in terms of hydrology, pollution, high salinity brine and stuff like that. And I've been doing a lot of testimony in the cases against the oil and gas industry. So at least in the area where I work, system synthesis is central to what I do. Now, I'm not sure about for the rest of biology,
Yeah.
I think one of the
So
interesting things you brought up was about going back to your learning at Chapel Hill was, the self-design. And I think that was in the title for the report
Yeah,
on the ponds that I've seen, and how that, in the Delta systems, you mentioned pulsing. I mean, they're really kind of the prototypical system that has this self-design to these kinds of pulses and these various inputs. I don't know how that kind of self-design thinking kind of affected your thinking throughout your career.
well, I mean, that's what I learned with Odum. I mean, my bachelor's and master's was sort of basic biology, not even ecology really, but just basic biology. So I learned that, but it was sort of humdrum, And then I met Odum, and he changed my outlook on everything, and so that's the only model I have to work on. I've done very, very few studies on particular individual species, and like I the lowest I go is sort of large habitats or that kind of thing, like freshwater forested wetlands, mangroves, salt marshes, fresh marshes, etc. And then
so
it
you,
got working with Charlie and Mike Kemp and Alex Yanez to write estuarine ecology. That's definitely the approach, and it's kept that. It's in a third. They just published the third version, and I was the author editor of the first two editions, and then I'm 78 now, so I'm sort of moving away from that. I'm a swan period.
Yeah, that's my first exposure to Hall and Day and Kemp. Was the estuarine ecology textbook. I was taking it with Clay Montague at Florida when I first got there in like 1994, and it was nice to see the diagrams and the systems thinking throughout.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, that was, and I think it sort of put an imprint on that book, and which is still there. And it's also this idea of getting a large number of people involved, because the third edition probably has 50 or more authors from all over the world
Mm.
writing the different chapters, but integrated in a way into the whole.
So we talked to Charlie a couple weeks ago. He had some really great stories about like his first interactions with Dr. Odum, like on a personal level. I don't know how much it seems different students have different stories, different kind of interaction, levels of interaction with Dr. Odum, I guess, on a personal level. I don't know if you had anything that was of note you wanted to share about that.
Well, I mean, Odom was just, he would get real excited, and one of my memories is we were on a field trip and actually had a tie on and a sports jacket, and we were out in the marsh down at the coast. And I don't remember if it was part of that project or when I with Odom, and they were all sort of Odom, it was a systems view, estuarine systems and ecology and systems theory. I can't remember. And but I mean, like, he just, something was happening in the marsh and he was talking about it, and some critter came up or something. He just ran into the water with his shoes on. I mean, he just a pair of leather shoes on, and he was just so, and he would just do things like that, and the students loved him. He would be laughing at him and being impressed at the same time.
I think he for effect, because I remember every course that I ever had with him, he would do something like that, be fully dressed with a tie and whatnot, and get in the water and then turn around. It's like
he would come to class a lot of times with just some papers, some like several pieces of paper with notes on it or something. And he started his lecture, and he was like a food chain or something, and he's got about 5 minutes in it, and he said, "Oh, that's the grocery market list." He was integrating that into a diagram about food.
Yeah, we used to accuse him, when I took systems ecology and whatnot from him, he had overheads, the transparent.
Yeah.
And we would accuse him of dropping them before he got to class and just totally mixing them up. And then it was just one transparency after another, but still would blow your mind, totally blow your mind.
Well, I remember that happening several times, that he would drop things. I don't know if he did that on purpose or not, but it didn't change the nature of the lectures.
So what classes did you get to take from him? So he must have taught
well, it was
marine.
this estuarine systems class, and ecology grew right out of that, because I started, that's the top, I had to teach one course a year. And so that's the course, estuarine ecology, and starting back in the early 70s. And then over time, there was this pressure in the community to write a textbook. And so putting one together, and finally it got published in 1997. And then I thought I'd never do that again. And then another one came out in 2013 because people said we need, and now the one just came out last year. That came.
What was going on with Environment, Power, and Society? So that was published about the time you were there. That must have been you saw a lot of the lectures before they were in the book, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and I remember taking a couple of seminars with him where he was talking about that, because it came out right at the end of his there at Chapel Hill, because it was 2000. It was 1971, mm-hmm. And looking back, I remember I read as a graduate student these 3 books, that one, and then Margolef's Perspectives in Ecological Theory, and then Whitaker's in Ecosystems. And those things really put together my view of how the world worked, and it led in all directions, because I've gotten into energy analysis with Charlie and doing a net energy return on investment. But an interesting thing is that when I was working down in Mexico, I was working at the University of Campeche, and I met these 2 Mayan archaeologists. One who was there, an American, but he lived there for 40 years, and Joel Gunn, who's a professor at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And they were working on Mayan archaeology, and I got to know them and would talk on over several visits because I was going down there fairly often. And we came up with the idea of what factors led to the formation of the first civilizations or state level organization. And because if you looked around the world, the first examples of urbanism, state level organization, mostly occurred in the coastal margin ecosystems, and a lot of them in deltas. And in talking with these guys, they all occurred within about 1,500 years of each other, about 5,000 years ago. And in talking to them, and I said, well, they were thinking of the archaeology and because this was down in the southern Gulf of Mexico was one of the instances where state level organization occurred, the initial ones. Some people call it pristine state formation. And it only happened 7 to 10 times in the whole world. And then everything else copied because, people were hunter-gatherers for almost 300,000 years of the time of our, then about 10,000 years ago, in the beginning of the Holocene, they start forming. And that's a climate, that's the end of the ice age. And then about 5,000 years ago, they get into big urbanism, major big urban, not just villages, but with monumental architecture and public works and a lot of social stratification. And they were saying, well, really understand why it happened all at once. One guy calculated it was supernova law. All of a sudden, within 1,500 years, you have 7 to 10 state level organizations of big urbanism. And I said, I remember the conversation. I said, well, it was because of the coastal zone. And we started looking at it and concluded that it was the burst of coastal margin productivity and like deltas, but also lower river valleys, because they were, instead of being entrenched, they now have really fertile natural levees. That it was that you had this big energy infusion that wrote the initial examples of urbanism, of state level formation. And that was we published the first paper in 2007. And I think that's come to be just accepted now in the archaeological community and talking about urbanism. And so it was because of deltas really and coastal margin productivity, because not only did they expand in area, they expanded in productivity per unit area, and that carried through to fish, nectar and stuff that has a lot of neat compounds that help neural development. And so that was an outgrowth. You could sort of trace the arrow from Odum to that. And then working with, do y'all know Robbie Berger?
No.
He was a student of James Brown, who was a very well-known macroecologist at the University of New Mexico. And I just met them because I was traveling there. And anyway, we started working with him, and we published a paper several years ago now, showing that if you look at the proportion of people who are in urban areas and by country, it's almost a linear relation between the proportional people living in cities and energy consumption. So what allowed, it was just like the initial city formation, energy from nature, but now we have the fossil fuels of the Industrial Revolution. And, it's just sort of a straight line that as countries urbanized and went through the urban transition, they used more and more energy, and that's why it happened. It wasn't because we got smarter or figured out a lot of new things. We did that, but what underwrote that was was energy. It was fossil and its ability to get more out of nature. So that's a component of my research.
Yeah, that was Leslie White's idea that societies evolve in proportion to the amount of energy that they're able to capture.
Yeah.
sometimes he's very popular, and other times with the anthropologists, they say he's all full of baloney. But yeah,
It's like
Well,
that. Go ahead, John.
that's the other thing I learned from Odum. I I learned thermodynamics from Odum, and then he made me take a course in physical chemistry, which was the sort of the classic way people learn thermodynamics. They don't learn it in an ecology course. They learn it in physical chemistry or engineering or something about how to build a power plant. And most people don't appreciate how universal the laws are. They're just absolutely there, and you can't get around them. And that's the maximum power principle. And I learned thermodynamics from Odum first, and that it affects everything,
sure.
and it wasn't some engineering or physical. That's all it was,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
for
had the
sure.
same experience. I learned thermodynamics from a mechanical engineer at NC State. Came out of the class, really couldn't tell you what entropy was. No concept, a way to verbalize it or think about what it was really in the world. And then I got to Florida and you start learning, Dr. Odom's version of it. And it's like, oh, okay, this is this is a pretty straightforward idea,
Yeah.
energy
Well,
quality.
I had 70 students. Well, 70 student degrees, because several of them got both degrees with me. And the last two graduated in 2017. And I quit taking students at that point. And well, I had already. And one of them was a guy from Alberta who got an undergraduate degree in engineering, and he started hearing about energetics and all of that. And I think he first contacted Charlie, and he said, well, you ought to go work with this guy down at LSU. And he had like almost a 4.0 average in engineering. So he comes down and works with me on my last funded project, by the way, which came out of the BP oil spill. And it was talking about how to manage the Mississippi Delta and whether you should just have big diversions and let the water go everywhere, as Odum would have said. And so he went through a 2-year project, got a master's degree along with one other student who had studied with Charlie at SUNY Syracuse. What is it? SUNY Syracuse, I guess it is. Huh?
ESF, environment science,
Yeah,
and
that's
forestry.
it.
Yeah.
And so this guy was looking for something to do, and so he came down to work on a short-term project that I had about the issue of Mississippi Delta, and he came down and ended up staying on for his master's degree, and then got a PhD at the University of Vermont, Adrian Wegman. And we're now gotten back together and are working on a big synthesis paper about the future, the effect of, waning fossil energies and net energy on the future sustainability of society. And but anyway, this engineer, he just an amusing anecdote. We went up to Vicksburg. We had some funding from there, and we wanted to get some information from the guys. We went up there and spent a day and a night, and we were driving back, and we got in the discussion of, they were both taking physical oceanography, but it was the first course, so you had to teach all of it, from biologists to physicists. And I asked Adrian what he said, oh, it's really interesting. We're learning about, ocean circulation and the Coriolis force and all of that. And I asked Jeff, I said, what do you think? He said, I don't understand why you would put in something in words that you could put it in an equation. But anyway, when he left,
That's the exact opposite of HT, by the way. The last thing you do is put it into an equation.
yeah. But anyway, he told me at the end, and in fact, he gave me a little note that's sticking up here somewhere. I really appreciate all you've done for me, and especially teaching me in other words, the broad universal view of what thermodynamics means, how it controls everybody, everything. And let me show you something here. So I'm lecturing. I hadn't taught a course since I retired in 2005, and LSU got a grant from some foundation to start an undergraduate Delta course, and nobody was doing anything about it. And they came and said, "Would you help teach this course, organize it?" And so I agreed, and I taught. One thing, it was the first undergraduate course I ever taught. Second, it was in the honors college, so a bunch of bright students, and they got into it, and I taught about thermodynamics and what it meant, and you about dissipative structures, Prigoggine's ideas, and so I was teaching that in the course, and so I got I don't know if you can see this, got my granddaughter to pose. You see apple there.
I'm a dissipative structure.
And then in fact, she spent the night with us last night, and I show this in a lecture. And here's my diagram. Here's my example of reversible thermodynamics. That's salt and water. If this jar would survive the age of the rest of the time the universe is here, it would look the same. And I was telling the students, there's lots of work there, but nothing useful. Anyway.
Yeah, energy quality. Very important concept. Something that came up to me the other day, I was with one of my colleagues here. He's retired from the USGS, and he's developed a fascination with Evelyn Hutchinson, Odom's advisor. So he was asking me about what I knew about Hutchinson. And I was like, Odom really hardly ever talked about him. I don't know if that was true back in your day, if there was anything he ever said about him, or if he maybe, I don't know if you guys ever got to meet him or anything like that.
Well, not that I remember. I mean, we knew he was one of Hutchinson's students. I think Odom was so unusual of that generation that the others of Hutchinson students, like MacArthur and who else?
Oh yeah, I just saw the names. Can't think of them.
But I still think they would consider sort of traditional ecology, and Odom was so far out that I don't know how well he fit, and I can imagine him arguing with Hutchinson too.
I recall him talking about that he did not have the best relationship with Hutchinson.
Yeah. Well, anyway, one of my former students gave me this book about Hutchinson. Yeah. And I've read some of the sections on Odom, and they're sort of really brief, and I got it about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I've been busy. So I was going to try to get an idea, but it's a biography of Hutchinson by a woman named Nancy Slack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think I picked up that book. I read a little bit of the beginning of it. There's a lot of accolades for Hutchinson from his former students and E.O. Wilson, and giving him a lot of credit for being the father of ecology and so forth. But I think there is very little on Odom. And I think it probably goes back to their relationship. I think Odom didn't rely on him and didn't really work with him anything after he left Yale. I don't think they really collaborated ever again.
Oh, I don't think so either. And Odom's dissertation was on a global budget for
strontium.
Strontium. Strontium.
He froze.
I know.
Hope he comes back. You still there, John? Strontium killed the Zoom connection. Oh no. Well.
Oh, there you are.
There you are. Yeah, we lost you for about a minute.
I don't know what, I have one of those boosters, but well, anyhow.
Yeah. So not much there. That's good. That's good to know, though. What else?
Well, one thing I think is a love of field. Like all of us, I think to me, science is getting out in the field, in the real world. Field scientists, I think, are a different kind of crowd than people who do everything in a laboratory. Because, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that most field scientists that get out in nature a lot, they have a almost spiritual relationship with nature, as well as the quantitative kinds of things we do. And the other thing is working in the field with people where you're out there for several days at a time often is that you build a much stronger relationship with your colleagues.
For sure.
And so I the field, down in Mexico. I worked on the Pacific coast, Gulf Coast, down in the Caribbean. I worked in those in the Mediterranean and in Venice Lagoon, and the Mississippi Delta, of course. And then with Bill Mitch up and down the Mississippi Basin, and going in the field to me was just part of it was fun and enlightening, and that's what field scientists, they just love going in the field, and then bubbling out of that is putting it all together, this idea of the pulsing paradigm. And coming out of just to give you an idea, coming out of my second sabbatical in the Netherlands, I ended up with a guy named Roel Boumans coming to LSU, spent a semester, and then stayed on and did a PhD with me. And we published the first paper. Do you all know what the sediment elevation table is?
The what?
Does that ring? The sediment elevation table, SET. It's called the SET, and it's a device where, it's a device that you put a pipe in the ground of one sort or another, and cement it in. It's fixed. It doesn't move up and down, and you have this thing that connects on it, and an arm that sticks out that has these pins, lower them down to the surface of the marsh generally, and you can look at change over time of and then how that compares to sea level rise or relative sea level rise, for instance. And this device, the sediment elevation table, Roel and I published the first paper. It was in a technical report, a sort of a preliminary design of one in Dutch that the Dutch used when they would put up these brush fences and reclaim part of these tidal flats into and they would trap sediments and build up. But Roel and I published the first paper in a reviewed scientific journal in English, and highly cited. And that device, the sediment elevation table, in conjunction with marker horizons, where you put down a marker on the surface, usually a white clay, and you core down and you look at the depth, the accretion of that clay, and you compare it to the elevation change, and they're not the same. And it's caught on, and I put the first ones in the Mississippi Delta, the first ones down in Maryland, and then we put, with these teams I was working with in the Mediterranean, we put them in those three deltas and in Venice Lagoon. And that thing is now, there are thousands of these sites across the world, and people do comparisons on them. And so that was one of the things that Roel and I were responsible for introducing this device to the broader scientific community. And then at the same time, I don't know if you all know who Don Cahoon is. He worked at LSU and he worked with USGS, and he took that over, and he really spread the sets all over. But he and Denise Reed and I published on what's called shallow subsidence, and it has to do with what's happening in that, basically the rooting zone, the upper couple of meters, whether as soils compact and organic matter is decomposed, you get that leads to a sinking of the surface, and the idea with rising sea levels is whether that can keep up with that, and that the sets combined with the idea of shallow subsidence is thing in elevation, accretionary dynamics in coastal systems all over the world. And both of those papers are highly cited because we did the first one.
So what is the kind of the status of the world's deltas? And most of them are subsiding. I mean, this relative rise is happening globally.
You have a geological subsidence in big deltas. You know, the Mississippi Delta is 10 meters thick. And so all of that 10,000 meters has built and compacted over the last 160 million years after the Gulf of Mexico opened up. And deltas maintain their elevation because of the rivers that bring in sediment and stuff, but also suspension of material from coastal bays in the coastal ocean up onto wetlands that allow them to continue to accrete vertically, grow vertically. And so the idea of pulsing in deltas is you have this spatial and temporal hierarchy of pulsing events going from, well, the biggest one is the glacial interglacial thing every 100,000 years, because once you get in the glacial period, sea level drops, 100, 150 meters. And so those big deltas are up on dry land then, and then back up and the deltas rebuild. And so they take different courses.
They have a solution for this.
I think he's in a rural area, so that connection is great.
Yeah. We lost you there for about a minute, John. So I don't know if you want to. You just talking about the interglacial period in the 100,000 years.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so that's first level of pulsing. The second level is the river comes down and a delta makes a huge, because it doesn't stay in one channel. It builds distributaries. In the Mississippi, I think, has 7 or 8 major distributaries, but thousands of minor distributaries. And then you have major river floods, big events like hurricanes and frontal passages, which mobilize sediments and move them deltas, then tidal cycles and waves, and all of those contribute. And what you can see is humans have impacted every levels. And so the status of is not good around the world.
So it's pulses within pulses within pulses.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I was invited last year, maybe around summertime, to write a review article on coastal. Well, they wanted me to do a review article on wetlands worldwide, and I said, it's just too big. I was trying to get out of it, and I said, maybe somebody could do coastal, and anyway, in the end, against my better judgment, I did it. I accepted it, and they have a word limit and limit in sector. So, I immediately did what I always did. I went out and found experts, and I got on that. This guy Savitsky's a guy from USGS, Mike Oslin, Jim Morris, who's a big coastal wetlands person, and a number of others to work with us. And we wrote this paper, and we're in the last stages of getting it published right now. And so it's going to be a big review on coastal wetlands. And the bottom line is it doesn't look good for coastal wetlands. Sea level accelerating. I think we're moving past points of no return on climate, and the political social system is moving in the wrong direction on all this. I think if Trump gets elected, we're finished in terms of climate. It may already be that way, but anyway, so and there's also in that review paper, we talk about the social system in deltas, human systems in deltas, and most of the mega deltas are in the tropics. Most of the world, half of the world population lives within 200 kilometers of a coast. The deltas compose a really significant fraction of the world's coastal wetlands. and climate change is doing all sorts of things in conjunction with humans, building dams, blocking sediment and freshwater flow to the coast, and sea level is rising and subsidence is taking place, all those kinds of things. And so we published a paper last year. Charlie was a co-author about, we called it the coming perfect storm, in a new Cambridge University Press journal called Coastal Prisms. And it's just all these things are coming together to wreak havoc in the coastal zone. The population lives, much of it in the tropical zone.
Well, you
So
know,
does it look,
quite a career, some 50 years in academia. I spent 30 of those years with him. I watched his interests change significantly over the years. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was his career is going along, and he has an interest in estuarine systems, and then he has an interest in wetlands, and then he has an interest in emergy and energy. And as the students peel off, they peel off with what he was interested at the time. So you're a estuarine systems guy. And it's fascinating to me that people that peeled off haven't come back around and looked at what he was interested in after they left. So for instance, Charlie totally refuses to buy into the concept of emergy, because he left long before that was part of Odum's interest in his technique. So I wonder how you see all of that.
Well, I've stayed true to a holistic systems approach, and you only have so much time. And I think Odum peeled off of field work too. And
Oh, yeah.
I just enjoyed field work too much. I go in the field. And so I became, I'm a field scientist. And it's not that I abandoned any of his views. It's just what I did took a lot of time. And I made all of these process-oriented measurements, which is what Odum taught me to do, quantitative things, and then I did it in a number of representative systems, so that I made those measurements, flux studies, productivity studies, et cetera. And then I could do intersystem comparisons, and I could look at deltas, pretty natural, and deltas which were highly altered. And so I think Odum would like what I've done and wouldn't think
no question about that.
And
but you said yourself you're
just
interested in energy, and you've been doing net energy and energy return on investment, and so you're sort of moving in a larger realm, and so it's fascinating to me that you all haven't picked up on energy quality and the whole concept of emergy, that you've sort of just dismissed that and said, well, it's not something that we're going to try to understand, I guess.
No, I never dismissed it. It's just I never did. You can only do so much. And and I had a thought.
You did some emergy work when Jay Martin was there with you, because Jay came from HJ's group, and
I wasn't opposed to it. It's just I don't think I have time. And that's the other thing, is I worked with people and I put together teams, and I had to have people who on the team who did these things. I've had 70 students. I've over 550 co-authors, and those were my community I was working with to do my work. And I never rejected emergy, and it was another way of talking about energy quality, and another way of understanding net energy. And it made intuitive sense to me, but I just never became a practitioner of it, I guess.
Yeah, understood.
well, I think it takes a level, a huge level of effort to get into the details to be able to do the calculations the way that Odum was teaching it. So
Yeah, and I think there's something there. It's just my career took a certain pathway, and to do what I did took a lot of time, and a lot of, like I say, I spent 8 years out of the country, I think. And so
Did you, so you did more collaboration with ecological modeling. Did you do some of that yourself? Or like, I mean, Odum was showing you analog models back in the day. I don't know if
Oh,
that's something that affected your thinking or you used
well, yeah,
throughout.
no, he was moving while we were at Chapel Hill. We was moving around away from those analog things because, very labor intensive, and computers were getting better. And so early on, Charlie and I published that modeling book with a whole bunch of examples. But I'm not a computer whiz, and so I did very little coding, and probably have 50 publications on various kinds of models, uh, looking at ecosystems from various ways. And I did very coding.
Yep.
There's a rhythm to the blackout here, I can tell. Just when we're getting to something good, punchline.
You did the coding. My mind didn't work well that way, and I let's
Yeah,
see. I think yeah.
you're there now.
So there's things I would, maybe if I did it all over again, I would, I would do more. I would go different places, but uh, I had fun, and I'm still having fun.
Oh, having fun.
And what I've carried from Odum is the systems view and the love of the nature and getting out in the field and making measurements and then synthesizing them. And I probably have 50 or 60 synthetic publications, review articles of different kinds, some
Mhm.
of which have been highly cited. I have, I don't know, 30 something thousand citations.
Mhm.
It's funny you talk about his love of being out in the field, because I got there in the 90s and he kind of had moved away from going out in the field a lot. But I can see the evidence of that at the Center for Wetlands through Mark and Ronnie Best and the other folks that there, Clay Montague. There was a field component to every course I took there that I think, now that I think about it, so it's incredible that that influence carried on. And it is so important to be able to go out in the field and understand it at that level. And like you said, you really get to show your passion to the students too. Really, it's an inspiring
Yeah,
activity.
being out in the field with students and being in the field really helps build relationships among scientists, because you know,
Uh,
Mhm.
waiting, waiting, waiting.
not,
You guys are you can, there he is. Sorry, we lost you again, John.
yeah. What was I saying?
But the field, working with colleagues, really building relationships, being out in the field.
Oh yeah, and you just, you get to know people. You're eating together. You're suffering through yeah. There's rarely really perfect field trips where everything works, the weather's perfect, no mosquitoes, etc. And you're solving problems, and you're out there and you're seeing nature, sunsets and stars at night and stuff like that. And then you have you're pulled away from a sort of a regular schedule, and it's just, I mean, field work to me is fun, and it's exhilarating, and you lead to, I've had new ideas, sit field working with people and then getting in a discussion on something else while you were doing sort of these repetitive routine measurements, temperature measurement or collecting a mud is in and of itself not all that great, but you start putting that together. Just let me give you an example of the kind of thing that can happen. You probably don't know this, but there was this huge flood in 1927 on the Mississippi River. It changed the way humans, engineers especially, look at the river. It flooded an enormous amount of, like 10% of the population was flooded, or it was something like that, and blew up the levee south of New Orleans, let the river flow out to help protect New Orleans, which in the end, it didn't make any difference, and the people down in the parish south of New Orleans still remember it to the day. You know, I would have a student worker who wasn't even a scientist, just washing dishes. And I remember one of them said to me, yeah, they did that. That's when they flooded the parish, you know, and I was, but so anyway, a big crevasse splay went out there. It was an artificial one, but it acted like a natural one. And it went up to the discharge went up to 10,000 cubic meters a second, which is bigger than most rivers. And so this one crevasse, it opened up to like 2 kilometers wide and just flowed for 3 months. And they just had to let it go. And when the river went down, they rebuilt the levee. Well, that was 1927. Sometime, and maybe it was around 2010 or something like that. I was sitting out in the marsh with several students. We were, I think, collecting cores or something, and literally sitting in the marsh, you know, and you could see New Orleans over there, you know, 5 miles away. And we were sitting right where the flood went. And we started talking about, well, I wonder if you could measure that flood when it went across the marsh. I wonder if there's anything down there. And this is like 50 years later, and nobody had ever done it. And we had a machete there. We were cutting little square sods of soil and taking them back. And well, let's see. And I just started digging it out with my hands, you know, and it was just coming up a root mass and stuff like that. And I was just about to get up. My arm was about that far down, up to here in the mud. I was just pulling mud out, soft, squishy, rooty mud, you know. All of a sudden, boom, I hit this hard layer, scooped it up. And it was essentially white river clay. It was grayish, which means it wasn't dark, so it didn't have enough organic matter to use up oxygen and go anaerobic. And we discovered the layer like that. And nobody had thought to look for it. We came back and did a systematic survey, and we found out the thing covered 130 square kilometers. It was in some places, it was almost 50 centimeters of sediment cleared out. And we described that crevasse and then published the paper on it. And now we're under consideration of some modelers who found out if you did it today, you would get much, because there's only about half the amount of suspended sediments, or much less than that, in the Mississippi River.
Mhm.
Wow.
This thing just grew out of sitting there in the marsh, you know.
So is there talk about doing like archaeological studies on what's underneath the layer? Because this is the parish, so this is inhabited land, right? Or is
Well,
it not?
no,
It's
this was
mostly-
out in it was out in the wetlands.
Oh, okay.
You know, down that further south, the natural levee that people can live on is rather narrow there, maybe not a mile, less than a mile. And so we were sitting out in what was wetlands back then, you know.
Mm,
And so,
nice.
but you know, Indian middens are, right? Those
Say it one more time.
Indian middens, shell
Mm,
middens.
yeah.
And there are thousands of them along the coast, and you find them worldwide now. I've seen them down in Mexico. I pulled some pieces of pottery. Look at this. Out of an Indian midden down in Laguna de Terminos that was probably high. And the thing was just eroding, and these pieces were falling in the water. That's a big pot there, look.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. And well, yeah, it was fun. And the thing is, I guess one of the things is I don't cite Odom's work very, because what he taught me was an approach, the systems approach. And, you know, like Inowee and the Silver Springs and the rainforest. What I did, I went out and studied whole ecosystems. And oftentimes we didn't do interventions like they did it with the radioactivity at the rainforest. We went to places where humans were doing the things. They had done something here and not here. we looked at these experiments that you could never get NSF to fund, but humans had done them. We put levees along the Mississippi River. We eliminated input into most of the deltaic plain, and that's true worldwide. And that the idea of pulsing came after I spent a year in Mexico and started the studies there, and then went into the Mediterranean, started those studies, and all of a sudden the same thing's happening on every scale, you know. And now that's a central organizing principle to understanding how deltas formed and are sustainable.
You mentioned Anahuac and Silver Springs and all. Early in HT's career, he published in the peer-reviewed literature. And as you well know, his publication record is phenomenal. The number of things that he has written is phenomenal. But the thing that's quite interesting to me, and like your take on it as well, is that later in his career, he quit publishing in the peer-reviewed literature pretty much. I mean, every once in a while, he would put something out there. And he also quit writing proposals as well. And I remember one time him saying to me that it's worthless, the science that NSF is funding, because the peer review system is crazy. They only will fund stuff where there's no new science. And if you come in there with some really far out science, they won't have anything to do with it. They only want to publish, tried and true science. And so what's your take on all that?
Well, my take on it is that I got funding to make the measurements in the field.
We lost you there for a
So,
minute.
well, I just said that I got dollars to do research and to go out in the field and do the things that are fun and are interesting.
Yeah.
But almost never did I get any funding to do synthetic work. That just came because me pushing people, and it's always with a group of people. You
Sure.
know, I think I have one publication where I'm the sole author. And sometimes they have 20 authors, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where the idea of pulsing came from.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the idea of the set table and came from.
Well, so my theory on HT and not publishing in the peer-reviewed literature was that it was he considered it a waste of time to have to satisfy these reviewers that didn't understand what it was that he was saying and what he was trying to do with his science. And he's had said any number of times that after about 20 years, people start adopting the stuff that I was doing 20 years ago, and it becomes sort of mainstream science then. But so he's seemed to always be ahead and having a rough time getting published. So
yeah, I can see that. Well, it's just the thing. I never lost my love of field science, so I was always generating data,
yeah,
and I think to a lesser extent, of course, but I think I was able to excite people the way Odum excited me. And, people like to come work with me. That's what I realized that
yeah.
like I have twice as many, I was a major professor, twice as many students as the next person in my department. So I hadn't checked it for a bit, but, and students like to come and work with me. I think half of my students, I got them in to do international travel and work in other places, and and the other thing about Odum is he challenged you. He let you run, and he pushed you, and that's what I did with students.
Yeah.
I spent a lot more time working, on the bottom third than I did on the top third.
Oh yeah.
A smart student who could write in. That was a gem,
One of the questions we got on the topic with Charlie was what Odum was like during your PhD defense. I don't know if you had any stories from that. If he knew what you had done, he was good with it. Go ahead. Sounds like maybe, or he give you a rough
Oh,
time or anything?
no, not at all. I mean, it was a very traditional carbon budget. I had to do some interesting things about to calculate diffusive flux across the air-water interface. We had those floating domes, and we put some kind of, I forgot what it was, titanium dioxide or something that
Mm.
that we had to show that it mixed. So we introduced it. It produced a kind of a smoky thing that dissipated very quickly, and we could show that it mixed in the dome, and therefore we could assume that what the concentration we were measuring going into the dome and coming out was really a reflection. We weren't analyzing it, and so
Hmm.
we had an infrared analyzer that was measuring CO into the dome and coming out, and then making some assumptions about the eddy. This was a shallow pond, so it wasn't really that difficult, and calculating diffusive coefficient. So that one of the big components was the amount of carbon that was diffusing in and out of the ponds. And during the night, would diffuse out because it'd be all respiration. In the day, it would diffuse in. You had to correct your ecosystem budget for that amount of carbon that was non-metabolic.
Classic productivity study.
Yeah, uh, yeah, and I never lost that. See, Odom got away from that. Even as an old guy, I still feel.
Well,
And
that's
and I,
I mean, that's your first. I mean, your first exposure to kind of ecological engineering. I don't know if you guys were throwing around that term back then, or but you've continued with that work, right? On the doing
well,
constructed wetlands and stuff.
constructed wetlands. There's a assimilation wetlands using natural wetlands, introducing treated sewage effluent in. It's treated, it's tested for toxins, etc. And there are a number of cities in Louisiana who use that. They save a lot of money and they enhance wetlands. And we did a lot of that. Bill Mitch and I published these papers on wetlands throughout the Mississippi Basin and what they were doing. One of my last big projects was with him looking at the Mississippi Basin. We had sites up in Ohio at, in the Mississippi floodplain across from Memphis and down in Louisiana where there were diversions, and looking at nutrient dynamics, nutrient uptakes, loading rates, etc. And it was interesting. I got to go to all those places and go out with the students who were doing the work.
Yeah, good
That,
work.
that turns into the key that else is doing the work while you're out in the field.
You're out there socializing. It sounds like from what you're saying,
Well,
making out the connections.
no, I mean, field work is a socializing thing. It,
Uh-huh.
it, I think it helps people interact better, because and it builds teams, then the whole thing.
I think that's one of the things I noticed when we were at Florida was, as a grad student, he really promoted that the physical space that he created was for was very open plan for have students to interact, and you got to know everybody on the team, whether they're working on your project or not. And
Yeah.
I don't know where that started with him, probably a long time ago, but it sounds like that's something that you just naturally fell into as well.
Well, my master's project was working with this fluorinated hydrocarbon that they were spraying on sugarcane fields, and I was did the lethal LD50 for these sunfish, and I mean it was incredibly toxic. And and I distilled it and did the analyses on a gas chromatograph or something, and I decided when it was over, I was getting out of that stuff. It was poison. And then I went to Odom, and it was me in a lab with a couple of other people, and it was really kind of humdrum. And you get with Odom, and they just it expands your mind, and you have this team you're working on, and all of the things that come together in those big projects if they're well done. And I just never left that.
I got to visit the ponds, and like there was the estuarine, one of the regional estuarine meetings was near there in Moorhead City back in the mid 90s. And we went and visited, and there was still a professor there. I'm not sure which institution he was attached to, but he remembered the project. This is like 20, 25 years later. And he was telling
Yeah.
us what a phenomenal, project it was and being involved with it. I wish I could remember his name, but it's so long ago for me. But I don't know if you
Huh.
keep up with that. Is the pond still there, and anybody involved with it? Like BJ Copeland may have been involved with it. Is that right? Or he
Well,
was
he
there at
was
Chapel
there.
Hill?
I was in Chapel Hill maybe 15 years ago when the ponds were still there and they were still doing something. I was on taking an East Coast trip. My wife and I drove up, went to Chapel Hill. I gave a seminar and then went down to the coast and went I just went in, walked into the and started talking to people. We went out and looked at the ponds and they were doing something that I can't remember, but they are still there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but I mean, my science from the time I left was like that. It was lots of field work, big teams of people, synthesis, putting it together, getting the big ideas out.
Yeah, I
Energetic,
think.
the law
Yeah,
of dynamics.
I think I'm going to bring this back to where we started in the beginning. You were asking like, what are we doing this for? And my response is that, being from a person who met Odom much later in his life, near the end of his life, a lot of you guys that had been involved with him up to that point were just names on dissertations that I knew. I know that phenomenal scientists had done this great work. I see this as kind of an opportunity to really humanize everybody that's involved in this and really getting to know the scientists. I think that's something we kind of fail to do. Everybody kind of learns the scientists for what they do in terms of their work, but how did they get to that approach? How did you build these teams? Why did you think those teams were so important? So this is really valuable information to be able to share with the next
Yeah.
generation, I think.
Another thing is Odom's students, a lot of them became really big leaders in the next generation. And both from Chapel Hill and from North Carolina. And, you had me, Charlie Hall, Ariel Lugo, Scott Nixon, Costanza, Bill Mitch, you guys, and I could think of many more, probably if you could get my memory back. But I mean, he produced a group of leaders that went in all sorts of directions and really influenced next generation of people. I mean, the pulsing paradigm that was an Odom idea, and I just was able to put it together for deltas. And another thing is Will Connor, one of my students who retired from Clemson. He was a forested wetland ecologist. We published one of the first, this was a master's level thesis, and it was one of the first papers on this idea of seasonal flooding and freshwater forested wetlands, bottomland hardwood versus cypress tupelo. And it was one of the first places where that idea was sort of enunciated. And that went into this whole thing that came out of that about forested wetland ecology and the importance of seasonal and led to the flood pulse concept. I'm working with a guy now trying to if you look at whole river basins, you know what the flood pulse concept is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That holds for the sort of middle of rivers where you have a big floodplain and then the flood goes out and you have water flowing down the floodplain adjacent to the river through the wetlands. And of course, that's the big rivers that hardly happens because they're leveed and stuff. But then upstream of that, it's much one-way flow into these much smaller floodplains. And, these I don't know, 10th order streams or something like that. And so it's mostly one-way flow in and little small excursions into lanes. Concept. And you get down to deltas and it's one way.
Oh no.
Sort of a global synthesis of of a whole river basin and how it changes as you go down it. And yeah, it'll come out. It'll come out this year.
All right.
Oh, nice. The hierarchies of watersheds.
Well, that's. I mean, all of those ideas come from Odum, you know, and yeah, his. You know, the other person who, in terms of a general conceptual overview, who affected my life immeasurably, was Herman Daly.
Mm.
And he was at LSU when I arrived, and they basically drove him out. The Department of Economics. They wouldn't even. He couldn't get a committee that would pass his students because they became more and more rigidly neoclassical economics, and
Right.
Herman was throwing lance after the lance into the heart of neoclassical economics, showing just how bad it is. And now that's gone a lot more mainstream. And if you listen to Herman talking and Odum talking, it's the same thing. They both start with thermodynamics. You know, Herman would say, you know, low energy, matter energy, you know, that all the materials coming out of the ecosystem, big, full world, empty world. And so I started interacting with Daly, and we had a group that would meet about once a month. Costanza was in it for a while, and then they drove Herman out. I mean, it's a sick stories. And so those two worldviews, which are essentially the same, came together in my mind. And so it fit right in. And so, you know, I don't know if you guys have seen that 2016 book that Charlie and I and others did on what's the name of it? America's Sustainability of America's Cities and Regions. So, you know, it never,
Oh, yeah.
Springer never pushed it. And if somebody would have written this book from New York or California, it would have been a big bestseller, you know. But we covered in there economics, energy, climate change. Charlie's a co-author, and then several other of our students and collaborators. David Pimentel, who's a big ag guy, you know, Alejandro Yanez from the tropics. And so we put all that together, and these areas, red areas, we said those areas are basically unsustainable. The Southwest, you know, and all of that got into that book. And so, you know, and Daly got into the book, and Odum got into the book, you know, and that's where these ideas came from.
What do you think you've seen in terms of the evolution of people's acceptance of these ideas about the ecological economics in particular? Because I feel like in the 20 years that I've been away from Florida, I've been amazed at how, in various forms, these ideas have emerged into popular culture. We don't maybe not recognize their roots, but I feel like they're there. But you have a longer view of it, I think.
Well, I think Daly's ideas have gained wide acceptance, except within the central core of neoclassical economics. Those guys are lost. The only thing I think is going to help it is for them to die off, you know. But it's recognized. Daly is recognized. There's a where is this? I thought I was sitting here, but there was a recent biography of Daly. He died last year, you know, and this book came out right after he died, and the man who wrote it, I can't remember his name right now, but he had long conversations with Herman, and I had those conversations much through my life. Like I was on a National Academy committee on urban sustainability, and I was the only guy in there that telling them that the reason we have big urban areas is because we had cheap, and that's disappearing, and you know, and all your ideas about creating little green gutters and hunky-dory stuff like that, it's just nonsense. And then they let me say my piece in a little part of the report, but it was amazing to me the blinders those guys had on it. But we went up to Washington several times for And every time I went up there, I went to see Herman because we were old friends, you know.
Mhm.
But so Herman's work is identified with him. And I think it's because he was a better communicator and he wrote book after book after book. And Odom's work is everywhere. It just didn't identified with him. And
Latent ideas hidden.
yeah.
Um, I have a meeting in a few minutes. Mark, you guys are welcome to stay on. You got this, you're running the meeting, so
Thank you.
it's your Zoom. But I just wanted to say thanks, John. I had this idea and I told Mark about it back in October about doing a podcast and we could get all the former Odum students on, and he latched right onto the idea, and we're seeing the fruits of it. And I really appreciate the conversation and you being able to share all this with us. It's really timeless amount of knowledge that you're sharing.
Odom excited me. I mean, really, in a way that my education up to that point hadn't. And I never lost that excitement. And
I can tell.
yeah, no,
Yeah. Keep it going.
well, I'm just about over. I mean, I'll be 80 next year, you know, so the old energy's not there.
Yeah.
the
Well,
the
but
memory is the other part that it gets hard to hold on to the memory. And that's the
I've been impressed. Well, we talked to Bill on Saturday a little bit, so he's excited. Bill Mitch to do this, and we got Walt Boynton signed up and Ariel Lugo. So we're trying to get all the old students there.
I mean, just those guys right there. I mean, they were Odom students and they shaped their fields. You know, Bill with wetlands, Ariel with mangroves, that paper he published with Snedeker. That's such a classic.
Good.
Yeah. And I did a lot of tropical work. And so it was just infused with that, you know?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, great career. We probably could go on for another 3 hours, maybe cover.
Maybe when it's all over, we can have a big, not so much meeting as a party and
Yeah.
have a few
Yeah.
stories.
That'd be fun. Well, the ecological engineering meeting is in Blacksburg. Virginia Tech's hosting it this year in May or June,
Which
I
meeting?
forget.
Which meeting?
The American Ecological Engineering Society. We're going to meet in late May or early June. I forget exactly, but in Blacksburg. So I think we'll make a splash there about what we're doing, hopefully. So we'll get people watching it.
Nope, we lost him
I think
again.
he froze again. All right.
All right, David.
Back on.
Yeah.
I gotta get ready for my.
Comes back on.
He'll come back on. He always does. It might be there he is.
All right.
All right, John, I'm going to sign off. Again,
Okay.
thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Head out as well, John. Thank you very much. This has been a real treat to.
Oh, for me too. It's fun, to remember these things.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to listening to some of the tapes.
Okay. You take care now.
We'll
Bye-bye.
share them soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.